That's functional.
Okay. Jonathan, are you good?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna hit the record button. Tonight on the PowerScripting podcast, we are pleased to have with us Stephen Murawski. Hello, Steve.
Hey, how's it going?
Doing well. Oh, dude, you got your lower third out going and everything. Slick.
I do.
And we also have Michael Greene.
Hello.
Hello, Michael. You've been on the show before, haven't you?
Yes. Last time I was
recall.
here, I was with Mr. Charles Joy.
That's it. I remember.
Yep.
Are you still on the same team, the cat team?
I am, and he actually relocated from San Antonio to Redmond and joined the Azure Stack team. So
okay.
He is the go-to PM for Azure Stack.
Oh, cool. We shall have to have him on in that context at another time.
Yes. Yeah.
Jonathan, are you going to play with the special effects?
I'm trying not to. I'm trying to find the lower third thing.
That it's in Hangout Toolbox. I remember one time, it was like just when Hangouts, this version of Hangouts came out, and they added the ability to do all the, the funny faces and stuff. And me and Joel, like, we worked together at the time at Splunk, and we were chatting back and forth, playing with that, with the hats and all the silly stuff for way too long during the workday. It was ridiculous. Okay, let's. It's been. We're only about 50 minutes late to start the stream, so let's get right into it. Michael, Steve, I mean, who wants to go first? What is the release pipeline model?
I'm still fascinated with this lower third thing.
Yeah. Mine just reverted to me.
All right. I guess that was too aggressive.
I'll start. So this started back, I guess in December, maybe a little before there. And Steve and I were running into each other at various industry events, and we kept noticing that if you've developed your skill set and built a career for the last decade or so around Microsoft core infrastructure, especially in the areas of automation, and the people around you in the industry are participating in organizations where their DevOps culture is developing, there are tools and processes that have evolved to support that type of culture. But in many ways, we felt like there was not a good reference out there for people who had that Microsoft core infrastructure background. That just kind of brought to light, I hesitate to say, DevOps from a Microsoft perspective or anything like that, because I don't think it shifts as you move between platforms. But it's more just, this is what this all means if you're using Windows Server as your operating system, or if you're using Azure as a cloud, or if you're looking forward to Azure Stack, or if you've used Azure Pack in the past. These are the tools, these are the processes you should be thinking about. This is what it means to coexist with group policy. This is what it means if you're in a domain or not in a domain, just all of those questions. And so we set out to create something to answer that. And it has been downloaded almost 6,000 times. So there's definitely interest.
So what is it? It's a white paper, right?
Yeah.
How is this laid out? Is this a book that you read? Is it a section of guidelines? I mean, how is this broken out? And let's kind of walk through the organization and how you built it.
Yeah. So the way we approached it, and actually I've been using this for all of my sessions where I present this topic. We kind of do. You could call it a before and after, but it's like start off, define an area, and so we go through source, build, test, release, so it's all manageable bytes. You can kind of think about it: source control, build service, test automation, and release management. And we kind of start each section and define, this is what we're talking about. So a little bit of like a developer type definition, like when developers say source control, this is what they mean. And then we say, now, how does this relate to core infrastructure management practices? So let's think about things like change management, and you're always trying to find out who made the change, and when did it happen, and why did it happen, and when exactly did it reach production. So how can we use source control to start recording who checked in what to the source files that store declarative configuration, and why does that help you get better at change management? So we do that before and after for each section. Kind of define it. This is what developers mean when they use these terms, and then this is how it relates to operations. And the way that you've been doing it before is this. That sounds familiar? Okay, well, this is what it means to be using this new set of tools to follow that similar process. So I do the same thing whenever I presented it. I just break each section into, kind of the old way, new way approach to thinking about it, and that seems to make it a little easier to understand.
So who's the audience for this?
IT pros.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a conversation that we, for quite some time, people would ask, hey, how do I get started with this config management stuff? How do I get started with DSC? How do I get started with some of this DevOps stuff? And in a lot of cases, this paper tried to address that starting place. What are some of the basic concepts that IT pros should know, and how that maps, like Michael was saying, how that maps to what they've been doing today, and what that looks like in a more fluid process, and one that actually offers greater speed and consistency and stability. So, because there's a ton of people talking about things like the State of DevOps report and things like that, where they're seeing these numbers about the return that IT operations can provide business, and like the reduction in mean time to recovery and the amount of deploys a day, and they're like, how do I get to that? How can I get to that kind of capability? And the first step is actually kind of understanding these concepts and then using them with how we run infrastructure as well as our application deployment and development.
So are there a minimum set of tools which are required to use this model?
Yes. You need a person with a keyboard and computers.
All right, all right. That is a minimum set.
Yeah. Honestly, we call out a number of different technologies and tools, but there is no like one true path or one true tool chain that will make that will bestow upon you the DevOps or something like that, right?
Behold.
So as IT professionals, part of our job is to figure out what tools work best in our environments and what process we need to follow with those tools. In this case, process is more important than the tooling. And in some of my talks, I'll say like, hey, I don't care what source control you use, but you should use Git. And that's primarily because a lot of the open source stuff in this space tends to be stored on GitHub and all that. But if you're in your environment and you have a solid TFS infrastructure and you have a lot of people with TFS experience, stick with TFS if you got the licensing for it and things like that, and you don't care. There's nothing that says or you could use GitLab, or you could use Mercurial, or you could use whatever. I don't really care. I want you to use source control, and so it's not so much the individual technology as the kind of the concept areas.
Okay, so you are not shipping software. You're not mandating a specific set of tools. What are you doing? I mean, is it just a methodology and you sort of apply it as you can?
Yep. It's primarily informational because there's a lot of when you start talking about operating in more of a kind of a DevOps capacity and operating kind of at a cloud pace or whatever buzz term you want to throw at it, when you're operating in this newer style of behavior, we tend to follow more developer-y patterns and practices. We want to store our configuration information in scripts and source control. We want to control their release into our environment through a build process that's going to do some testing of their unit integration, all those kinds of things. And then eventually the funnel after testing goes out into releasing that into our environments, where rather than I take a script from my desktop and I copy it to some SMB share that now we can just use, and trying to figure out what the last version of that script was is, well, is there a .old file on there, or look at the file dates, or which version in which file share on which server is the one that we should be using. Let's take a step back and let's look at the process by which we do these things, centralize how we, and go from a single source of truth, and have a unified process that everybody can follow, and take some of the good thoughts from the ITIL processes, like a change management board, for example, and actually make them.
I'm sorry, did you just say that a change management board is a good thing?
No, I said good idea. I said so. The idea of reviewing changes before they go into production.
Okay.
And we put them in a process which people can actually do in a timely manner and actually has value, right? Because from a change management board perspective, there's no answer that they can give that is other than no, that's, that can be backed up by anything. Because our environments are complex. Nobody can know what 400 changes coming in are going to do to that environment, right? So what has been found through researching what's been happening in the industry, and you'll see this information coming out in the State of DevOps report and in some further stuff that's coming out from the researchers behind that, is that source control with peer review is way more effective than a change management board process. But you still have a process where changes are being reviewed. So you have a central place to put them. Now we can start talking about getting peer review before those things go into our build pipeline, for example. And so we can start taking advantage of the promise of ITIL through automation and tools and communication.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting conversation to have, where as soon as you say, we're only going to implement changes in production if they've been tested, which means everything's got to be declarative configuration or configuration as code, and tested before it'll ever even be considered something that would, like, you would never let someone remote desktop into a machine in production. And one of the responses I'll get back is, oh yeah, we're trying to get people's skill set ramped up on the command line, and that's good. That's the step in the right direction. But you can randomize a server at the command line just as effectively as you can through remote desktop, right? So it's less about being, oh, you shouldn't use RDP, or you shouldn't use some sort of remote, or you shouldn't use GUIs and that kind of stuff, and more about the process that you will not make a change in production unless the tests have passed, and that everything goes into source control so that you always know the latest version of the truth. And it's a significant change. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about what's the easiest way to introduce this into shops that are really a click next admin. And I don't mean that in a detrimental way. I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, that's how they learn to be administrators. So what's the best way to introduce it? And I agree that going to source control first, even if it just means here's the scripts that I downloaded from the internet that I'm going to try. Going to source control first makes a lot of sense. But I keep telling people, if I was going to learn a new skill in 2016 and I didn't understand Pester at all, if I'd never even looked at Pester is the thing that I would go learn. It's just that powerful. Or some test language, because that was whenever it clicked for me. That's whenever I finally got it. Like, oh, because a change window comes along. How do you know what you're changing? You don't know what state those machines are in. And how do you know for sure that this change isn't going to cause problems? And
it really does make a lot of sense in the sense that if you're storing your configuration as code and you write a declarative file that says go do this thing, be a web server or whatever, or load up a new version of this site, then if you write a test that gets executed through the pipeline that says, hey, is this a web server? Do I see the things that I expected to see after the change occurred? It's really rather obvious when you think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll throw a crazy comment out. So I think at some point in the future, making random changes to servers will be treated the same way that we treat security incidents. That doesn't mean like, oh, stop everything, red alert, we've got a huge problem. But the forensics that goes into that, so the narrative would be like, okay, we're going into a change window Saturday. We're looking at the logs for this server. Michael Greene, it shows here that on Tuesday you connected and you were connected for 90 minutes. So what were you doing? And it's like, oh, well, we had an outage. My boss was standing behind me, and we had to get it back. So I beat on the server for 90 minutes. I stopped and started services, and I installed some diagnostic tools, and then I took them back. So what state's the machine in? Well, the service is running again. Right? And that's all I really know.
But
so
what changed?
Change windows are terrifying because I might now go to patch this machine and I have to reboot it and it never comes back. And it's Saturday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Perfect.
Right.
Not really
exactly
perfect
what you
for me at all.
intended to be doing this.
Yeah, I mean, we've all lived that experience in various roles, and I know I worked in operations for a long time, so I've literally lived that experience. Mm-hmm. And whenever I started thinking through this process, and the more it was explained to me, the more I was just, yes, absolutely, this is the way forward. So that's what the white paper is all about, is to try to explain that in operations terms.
Yep, and we start out, we break it into 4 sections. So Hal, you were asking a little before about how we laid things out, and so there's 4 sections. We talk about source control, build process, testing, and release, and we kind of break it out with what kind of questions do each of these components answer, and then what are some typical tools you're going to see in that space? How does that actually and then how do they all kind of work together to getting you to a better state in your environment?
So it's not a hugely long read. I think 51 pages or so. How would you compare this to some other? I mean, there's been lots of writing in general in as far as DevOps methodologies. There are novels, of course. You've got the Phoenix Project, that kind of take at it. Where does this document fit in the tools and that you would give to somebody to get started? Kind of transforming their operations.
So I personally use it just about every time I start talking to a new customer or somebody who's looking to start getting started with configuration management, whether it's Chef or DSC, and like, okay, before we even go into kind of details about these technologies, let's level set and get some baselines on what we mean by things. And so I think it's a good kind of intro to the space for people who are interested in configuration management, and it's not even necessary for configuration management or requiring configuration management, but for anyone who's writing scripts and things to do things in production, and getting people on board with doing things in a consistent fashion. And so that's kind of where I've used it and where I've recommended it. Michael, I don't know if you've had similar.
Similar. So for the presentations that I do, I always link over to Stephen Murawski's reading list. So I make the point when I'm giving a talk that most of the topics that are covered in the paper are not our own original ideas. So we are standing on the shoulders of all these different authors, and I give credit by showing screenshots of all the covers of their books and pointing to Stephen's reading list, which is really a good resource if you haven't seen it before. So I absolutely recommend reading the Phoenix Project. That was the one that I actually sat down. ChefConf, I think 2014, on my way home. I started it first thing in the morning, and I finished it before I fell asleep that night on my travel that day. Like, I just literally could not put it down once I started it. But I had just finished 3 years in cloud operations and was transitioning back over into a PM role. And I was just flipping through pages, reading the story that exactly mirrored what I had been living through. So that was a really good one for me. But if you haven't read any of those, this is probably a shorter version that might apply more directly to you if you've got a Microsoft background. So it's a good place to sort of get your mind working, and then you can go read the other books for the more in-depth deep dive. But yeah, I've been using it as a reference in that way. It does sort of act as a table of contents, and I hadn't really thought about it that way before. But it is a good place to get started.
So there was a comment in the chat room I wanted to hit. What do you do about people who are resistant to change for various reasons? But one is just this is the way that we've always done it.
Yeah, that's not working. And so, you know, there's a couple of scenarios where you see that kind of commentary, right? And it's either so. I'm talking to an organization either because there's an effort, you know, from you know, like a central IT org or within some decision maker who wants to go down the config management path, and so maybe there's somebody internally that's, yeah, we do it this way, it's fine, and then you start saying, well, okay, well let's learn, let's see where we can add some additional value in the environment or whatever. And, well, we can't spend any time learning that because we're too busy fighting fires. Or our environment's too inconsistent for us to apply any sort of standardized compliance checks of anything, and they start kind of talking themselves out of that. Well, we've done it for years and years, and it's fine. It's not really fine. It's just the pain that they know how to live with.
Well, they've done it years and years, and each server is its own special snowflake, and they have to treat it as such.
Right. But how do you get from there to a state where you are using, you know, configuration management for the majority of your servers in an environment where you may have thousands of Windows servers in your environment? How do you then try and apply a configuration to those? Or do you just start with, okay, I'm drawing a line in the sand, all of my new servers are going to be managed with Puppet or managed with DSC?
I think for greenfield projects, you got to go that way. Yeah. For greenfield projects, you do have to at some point draw that.
There's no such thing as a greenfield project in an enterprise.
That's fair to say as well.
Yeah.
But I would say you could look at it as new servers we're deploying or anything you can get your hands around that for this project we're going to abide by a new set of rules. I think the more interesting question that you're alluding to is what about all these servers that are already out there? And I don't think you can take, I don't know how successful you would be at taking thousands of existing nodes and trying to backport them into a configuration file. I don't even know if that's attainable. But you
don't want to do that.
Yeah. But what you could do is start establishing baselines, and where you have operational practices where you are expected by the organization to guarantee consistency across nodes. This gives you a very interesting tool for attacking that approach. You could almost start off with the imaging team and sort of work your way up as you go. So if you went, I actually had one customer that's going to try that. So if you went to the imaging team and said, how do you deliver machines consistently to teams that are going to take on projects? And they say, well, we've got these images, or we have a gold image approach, or whatever. Okay, well, what goes on next? Well, we've got an anti-malware client, and we've got a backup client, and okay, well, how do you get machines to that state where you're ready to hand off? Can we start there and look at that as our baseline, treat that as something we're going to deliver using configuration as code, and then start, as this proves itself, go to the application owners, because ultimately they're going to own the tests that have to pass, and start working your way out. But yeah, tackling the machines that are already out there are really hard. I also think, to go back to your original chat room question, how do you convince people? And I think for the point in time we're at right now, that's a real challenge, because a lot of them, it's actually really funny. So they'll complain about, this process or that tool, and then you'll present them with the challenge of learning a new skill set, and they'll say, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Right? Is their way out of saying, I don't want to take the time to learn this new tool. I think the forcing function is going to be as machines move more and more to cloud-type solutions, because of that elasticity, and as that becomes a greater reality in the architectures that we design, if it really is an elastic service and the machine only exists for 20 minutes during highest demand, it's literally impossible to use the practices that we're used to. Like you can't get a machine built and point and click it to the right configuration and get the solution loaded and bring it into production and then bring it back down in 20 minutes and make it go away forever using the tools that we've all grown up on. I mean, it's impossible. So as those architectures change, I think that will eventually become the forcing function.
And one thing that I've done, going back to imaging servers, I actually integrated DSC into our SCCM build process. So during the build, it gets its configuration.
That's awesome.
So that's one way to do it. But you end up with an environment where if it's in the imaging process and all new servers are getting their configuration this way, you may have a mix of servers for an application, some of which are controlled by DSC and some of which aren't. And if I'm an ops guy, which I'm not, but if I were an ops guy, how do I know how to manage that machine? Because some of the tooling, especially around DSC, not great.
Yeah.
How do I know? That has to be captured somewhere in CMDB or somewhere so that I know how to administer that machine. And now I'm treating some machines differently than other machines because my job is to take care of any machine that comes to me when I'm on call.
Yeah,
so I mean it's not going to be an easy transition for traditional organizations that don't just that their business is more than a website.
Yeah, right. No one is saying that this is easy at all, right? These are hard problems and hard challenges, and in the case of like existing servers, for example, you spend a good bit of time looking at okay, what's the value prop there for a bunch of existing stuff out there, and that's where things like chef compliance really come into play, where now let's start selling the security and audit angle and getting that in place first and validating, because we have to do that stuff, right? We have to audit these environments, and we spend a lot of manual time doing that. Let's get that encoded in tests, and then that becomes a baseline for us when we want to move those existing machines under configuration management, because now we've modeled a bunch of it already, a bunch of this current state of the system. And you can do it. You don't necessarily have to do chef compliance. You can do pester tests around this, operational validation. OVF, this would be a great, that's kind of a great space for OVF as well. And so, there are tacks that you can go with where not necessarily just going whole hog into configuration management on existing nodes, but bringing it back and looking at some of the other automation challenges and operational challenges that we can tackle.
So to take Jonathan's point one step further, I actually think if you're an ops person and you get an escalation about a server that's being managed in this process, I think as part of introducing this process, you have to go into the paradigm where humans don't have access to servers. So that ops person isn't going to be able to just go log on and try to troubleshoot. They're going to have a different set of tools for collecting information, and it's going to be things like Splunk, right? So where you can go look at the logs that have been pulled off that machine. You might be able to use things like GIA to go do point-in-time data collection, but this is why it's interesting to look at things like web servers first that don't have a lot of state information stored on the node. I think it's going to be easier to tackle those problems first. For things like Exchange and Active Directory, it's much more complicated, and you're not really looking. So for a web server, you're probably just going to do, I'm going to kill off the web servers I have now and replace it, and there's like 5 different ways that you can go through that process, right? But you're basically wiping and reloading every time you do a new release. For something like a domain controller, you're probably not going to. So for every release of what you define as a domain controller, it's just going to be an iteration on what was already there. So you're introducing a change. There's really not a rollback. I mean, it's nice that you've now got this record. I know for sure what it looked like before this change, but there's really no such thing as rolling it back. You could introduce, if you're on your organization's 15.7 version of domain controller and you go to 15.8 and it sets some registry key and it causes a problem, you can go to 15.9 and change the registry key back. But it's not like group policy where you can change it back to not configured and wait. That's not going to exist. So it's a very different process. But like I said, at least you do have 15.6 that worked. In worst case scenario, you could redeploy that domain controller with the known version that was working and potentially restore if it's an application. It might be something like SQL. You could restore data from backup and things like that. So it does tie into disaster recovery nicely from that perspective, because you do always have the latest build doc, which is usually not kept up to date with our current process. So,
but part of this is trying to get rid of that build document, correct? I mean, the build document goes away and is replaced by the the DSC or the chef or the whatever.
Configuration as code, yeah.
I think as applications change too to take advantage of things like containers, this problem is eventually going to be a lot easier, because a server isn't going to be the same thing that it is today. It's not going to have the same. I don't know. It's like a server's an enormous football field now that you have to cover, and a container's like 10 yards or something. It's a much smaller.
You still have a server
to manage.
Yeah, but you still so containers don't actually take any of that away. They're just
they do from an application standpoint.
So right, but you still have a server that you're running on. You still have to manage all the things you had to manage before. There's just a delineation line there.
Not if you're not managing the servers.
But think about the philosophy that you just laid out there, and I love this. You're basically now treating that server as a PaaS environment. So platform as a service. You're treating that server like containers as a service, where you're just deploying and removing containers, and you're expecting that server to be perfectly consistent all the time. And that right there introduces a different way of maintaining servers.
Yeah, and that's where you can blow the server away and rebuild it and just move the containers off somewhere else, and your application's fine.
But so here's the other thing is, with containers, your application has to understand that it's in a container and be written to support that kind of deployment.
Right. Yeah. This isn't a near-term thing. This is a down the road 15 years thing.
Right. So because the whole thing about that is, if you don't know the platform that you're running on underneath, there's so much enterprise code out there that makes a bunch of assumptions about the hardware that it's running on, or at least kind of the hardware that's available to it to run on. And all those assumptions go out the door when you start running on a PaaS platform, right? You have very little information directly into that.
So
yeah, definitely.
Yes, sometimes, but I give you a counterexample. Splunk is a monolithic design, essentially. It's an all-in-one package. It does have multiple roles, but the packagers are all kind of the same, and the different roles are affected by configuration. We have a set of Docker containers configured in a certain way with a little bit of instrumentation around it that you can spin up a fully configured cluster of Splunk, with different front end, back end clustering and all this good stuff, and it just comes right up. But Splunk wasn't the design of the Splunk software was not changed.
Right, but
so I think that was an absolute that you set out that is actually not an absolute.
Well, what kind of performance guarantees do you make on it then?
None at all. In this particular case.
So that's just it. I mean, like with Chef Server, for example, when we have a spec out there that says if you want to have, we'll say you can have this many clients with assuming this particular hardware set, or at least these particular levels of system resources available. Mm-hmm. And if so you either have to be able to make those guarantees or not. And in most PaaS solutions, you can't make those guarantees. In IaaS solutions, where or internal data center type stuff, you can have more control there. Whether it doesn't matter whether it's Docker, VMs, whatever, you can have a little bit more control over what kind of resources are being dedicated to it, but not necessarily in a PaaS. Well,
But
at
what
least most of the PaaS solutions.
Michael, what should we expect of Azure Stack in relation to this conversation?
Yeah, so if you look at virtual machines as a service, Azure Stack, the API for Azure Stack is Azure Resource Manager. So the same way that you define a virtual network, your storage solutions, your storage resources, your virtual machines, and deploy those to Azure using Azure Resource Manager, and you define that template as a declared end-to-end infrastructure in JSON format, and then within that you can reference DSC extension for applying DSC configurations, or bootstrap it into the Azure automation environment, or use the Chef extension. That's the solution. And so what has cracked me up looking at this scenario, and this like smacked me in the face one day, is I was guilty of this very much myself. If I deploy websites as a service, and I turn that on in Azure, and then I deploy the website to it, and I don't like something about the website, then I make a change, and then I release the new version of that website to the service, and I expect that service to just always be there and be exactly the same. But I can't really manipulate what's happening, on underlying requirements. So as a tenant of Azure Stack or Azure, if I'm deploying virtual machines as a service, I can now use things like DSC extension that as a tenant I can define anything that I want to customize about that virtual machine, and that could be security settings, it could be regulatory requirements, it could be that my organization has a specific way we like to do things. And then at that point, what I'm changing from version to version is the application getting deployed into those VMs, and I'm appreciative of that the virtual machine as a service gives me that extra degree of flexibility. But what I was guilty of for myself is, I would go to the Azure portal and deploy a virtual machine, and then like, oh, I've got a server now running somewhere. Well, can I make sure that this is actually a server? And I remote desktop into it and start poking it around. And it's like, why did I do that? Why did I have this need to go log into the machine? Even if it's just over WinRM or SSH, why do I have this feeling that I have to go poke at it to make sure it's real? I'm expecting this thing to be perfect and always consistent, and then later I'll accuse it of configuration drift. Well, maybe that's because I went and poked at it for an hour after I created it, and that just hit me over the head one day with this big gravity, oh, I'm doing this to myself. And I think we will continue seeing shift.
Even Michael Greene of Microsoft wants to log servers.
Heck yes.
All right, so it's okay. There's going to be some sort of support group for this, right?
I hope so.
So there were some questions earlier about audit, the challenge of audit, and how that might be a little bit different. I'm trying to find it. Stephen, have you caught back up in the chat log where that was?
Yeah. So there was some questions about
difficulty in describing.
Yeah. Let's see here. I got it. All right. Yeah. So the question was server hardening. How do we do it with CM tools while the settings are hard to describe in codes and text? And my initial response in chat was well, if it's a computer setting, you have to be able to describe it in code and text, because that's how the Windows operating system works. You can't change settings without some kind of code or text. And he clarified it was coffee-powered line, and he's clarified audit policies and local group policies and things like that. And that there are INI and CSV files primarily that you're dealing with. And there's actually a DSC resource that is out there around the security options side of things that Chris Walker has it out on GitHub. I've got a link in the chat there to it. It's a security options DSC module. I think he finally dropped the C off of it. It's still in the project name, I think. But and so there's a DSC resource, and what he's using at his place of business is they are not doing any GPO or anything. They're just using that DSC resource wrapped in Chef. But you can use the DSC resource with whatever to do all of those security options and policies. One of the things that, and I don't want this to be like a commercial for Chef Compliance, but that's actually one of the things that Chef Compliance is really good at checking, is a lot of those security settings and things, and to validate those things. It actually ships with a bunch of out-of-the-box templates for Windows Server hardening checks to validate that they're in those particular states. Some of those things are harder to automate, but they're becoming easier as people start to hit this space and like, oh, we really want to automate these things. And so you start seeing DSC resources like the security options one come up.
So really, in a sense, I mean, if your server were perfectly managed using a configuration management tool, then audit would be a part of that, and you wouldn't need to audit it separately. Yes, correct?
No.
No. Okay.
So,
bad help.
no. So almost right. So the your config management can definitely be helpful documentation in dealing with audit, but what you configure and what the security policy is are probably two different things, and they're expressed in different language. And that's where a modeling language can help with that. And so InSpec is a modeling language that allows you to use audit-like language and describe your tests. So rather than saying, something like my SSH config will only be set to protocol 2, you can say that's going to be your audit finding, but the config management that does that is probably going to be a template resource that drops in a config file and edits it in a certain way, that kind of thing. And so what InSpec allows you to do is to sit down with your auditors and build and InSpec's open source. Anybody can use it. It can work with any particular config management platform. It doesn't have to be installed on the server. It can run remote. It can run remote and profile remote nodes. But you can sit down with your auditors ahead of time, build out. Okay, if our server is going to be compliant, what is that with your audit rules? What does that mean? And we can build these tests in a language that's familiar that's almost English-like, that they can read. It's kind of like writing pester tests, but with just some more higher-level abstractions on top of it.
Yeah, I get similar questions for operational validation, and especially for people who are working with DSC. And this ends up being a funny conversation, but you think for DSC, like, it's get, set, and test. So one of those words is test. I had to go write the resources and including the test function. So doesn't that cover me? And the way I always describe it is, what the scenario you were working through is like build a web server. If it's not a web server, make it a web server. Make sure IIS is there. Make sure you go get this content and put it on the machine. Make sure that it's got the certificates it needs and whatever. That makes the machine the web server, and then the operational validation is now go connect to that machine on port 80 and see what renders, and validate that the file that you get whenever you make an HTTP request to that machine is what you expect to get for the website. So it's this functional definition versus the website definition, or versus requiring that the machine become a web server. But what becomes funny about that is the natural response. I've seen this over and over again, people who go down this path, and they started off by saying, like, we became the automation experts. So we wrote scripts that build web servers. And then DSC came along, or Chef or Puppet came along, and we're like, oh, okay, well, yeah, we see the value of this. We're going to try this approach again now. So we're going to write all of our configurations as code, and then we're going to have operational validation, and that kind of stuff. And then they reach this point where they go, we have written 15 times the amount of code that we wrote back whenever we just had a 10-line script that built a web server, and the outcome is still just a web server. So what the heck happened? And it becomes really interesting because there's this whole conversation needs to take place about, okay, well, yes, you built the web server, but now you have a way to validate the web server is still healthy, and you know how to make a change to the web server and stuff like that. But there's all these phases of maturity, And I see people get to that first one and get frustrated. So, for anybody who's listening that's going through that, Steve has got plenty to say about this. But you really have to look beyond that first phase as to, okay, well, what's going to happen whenever you want to make a change, or you want to release that next version, or you need to validate that it's still in a healthy state. That it's the future proofing that makes a real difference. But doing it the right way does include more work. There's really no way around it.
So, Jonathan, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk because I selfishly need to take a screenshot of you. So now's your chance. Goodwood, that'll do. All right, you can talk or not. I don't care.
Nice.
So there's some comments coming up in the chat about OVF and if it's similar to InSpec or ServerSpec, and what's and if there's any pre-baked compliance profiles for that. Michael, anything you can chime in there on that?
So OVF. So the question is OVF versus things like PowerSpec and ServerSpec and InSpec. So OVF is basically organizing your tests.
Is this a different OVF than the was it like Open Virtual Disk format or something like that?
Yeah, this is the operational validation framework. It's a pattern for writing pester tests to validate the currently or the operations of servers and their their configuration settings, basically. So like Erwin, I'll mispronounce his last name, so I'm just going to skip it. Had a couple of blog posts around this. First one was on like an operational validation module for testing his Active Directory infrastructure, and it like validated site links and things like that. And so basically, you could just you'd be able to model what good behavior looks like, and it's basically like a health check. And so you can run this pester module and validate. You run, and there's a couple levels of tests. There's kind of like your quick hits and then your in-depth testing. And so you could run the two variants, and there's just a pattern for how you structure them and that kind of thing. One of the challenges with OVF right now is it's really not set up well for parameterizing. And there's no real way, there's no standard way to inject metadata into it to customize those tests in a standard fashion. So when you build those OVF tests, they're usually pretty specific to your environment.
So if I can take us in a slightly different direction for a moment, how many domain-specific languages must we learn?
All of them.
How many have we talked about just in this episode of the PowerScripting podcast?
Yeah, there are a lot. But as you start modeling things as code, that's really where that's really where things kind of land. Is we have a Saki for which is your DSL for build for a build process. You have Pester and OVF, which is a DSL on top of a DSL, and stuff like that. So
sounds like Chef and InSpec is that to Chef, is it not?
Yeah. So one of the common test frameworks that we leveraged in the Chef realm was ServerSpec, but it didn't have super great Windows support. And so a while back we actually had we acquired a company called VolcanoSec, and InSpec was what they were working on. And so InSpec is the engine behind Chef Compliance. So Chef Compliance is the commercial product, and then InSpec is the open source testing framework underneath it.
Gotcha. So where do we go from here? What are the the actions, the takeaways that you want to give to people in terms of this this white paper and transformation that they may wish to go through?
Go read the white paper.
And I'm interested in as you're looking at what guests to have in the future, for people who are going through the experience of this sort of transition, I'm fascinated by hearing everyone's experience. I mean, the biggest thing that I like digging into is there's no reason to throw away the tools that you already have invested in. So how are you using these practices together with all of the existing infrastructure management tools? And a lot of that looks like creating automation, storing it in source control, having the build server execute it, having the build server include tests about the automation for those things, and then as opposed to just handing off a DSC configuration, it's incorporating things like DSC and Chef and Puppet into some of the existing tools and utilities you already have. And sometimes that's really successful, and sometimes it's not. So I think the opportunity for the community to share those experiences and learn from each other is huge.
Yeah, I would just say, as far as like where to go, read the white paper, check out my reading list. But if you're not using some kind of source control in your environment, start using it. I'm getting a little feedback from somebody.
Yes, you are getting a little bit of feedback.
So if you're not using source control, start using it. The the audiences I talk to, that's getting smaller and smaller, which the people that are not using source control. So that's totally awesome. And then I'd have to say what Michael said earlier today, and that's start learning to test or learn testing, integration testing, unit testing, all that kind of fun stuff. So.
If nothing else, if you're thinking about contributing to some of these open source community projects in the PowerShell space, tests are becoming a hard requirement. I mean, not hard in terms of hard work. I mean hard as in it's required. The community is requiring tests for PowerShell modules, for DSC work, for everything.
Yeah. Check out Test Kitchen.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking for an integration test harness to test your configurations and things, there's a great blog post from Gail Colas on how to use Test Kitchen with desired state configuration. If you're digging into the DSC space, I'll drop a link in the Hangout for that, or in the Slack group for that.
Excellent.
Yeah, or even, I mean, so something that I run into a lot is organizations require IT to certify a new operating system. So, before you can roll out 2012 R2, you have to verify that all applications can work with that before we can retire 2008 R2 and just support 2012 that conversation. So imagine you had this big matrix that said, like, here's all my applications, and then here's all these versions of operating systems, and then you might have like versions of .NET in there as well. If you could just tell a build service, go spin up virtual machines in Azure or AWS, and like here's our applications. We have validation tests that make sure they do what they're supposed to do. Now here's a bunch of operating systems and combinations of things on operating systems. Just start working your way through that table and see what happens. And then 2012 R2 becomes a new thing. Check the box for that column. Here it is. And then 2016, okay, we're adding another column. We want to see if it works for 2016. We want to see which of our apps work on Nano. Okay, well, that's going to be probably a different set of automation. But you kind of get the idea where it's like, how do I even approach this problem? There's not enough hours in the year for me to go try installing all my applications on Server 2016 to verify that. And that's why it's 2020 before I can even consider adopting it. Well, things like operational validation and Test Kitchen become really interesting now because it's not human hours anymore. You can just say, hey, here's either our internal or public cloud, here's the images that you're going to use to test against, here's the application source, here's the operational validation tests, start running.
That so reduces the hurdle for people to be able to move to a new operating system. How many people just finished their 2003 to 2008 R2 migrations? Right? 2008 R2 is now going to be 3 major versions back. And it pains me that I have to support 2008 R2 for the next 4 years yet before it drops out of extended support. And so doing these kinds of things gives you the capability to move operating systems faster so you can take advantage of some of the newer capabilities more readily.
That is definitely a great goal.
So this is not the final word on this topic, right? This white paper. Are you planning to release new versions of it over time? Are you soliciting feedback?
Yeah, we'd love feedback, and whatever we'll definitely take whatever feedback in. And I don't know if it's revisions to this particular one or new publications, but yeah, we should definitely have more content come out as it's.
Yeah, I think the first thing we need to go through is create. It could be like how-to videos for Channel 9 or something like that that kind of walk through some different scenarios. So for people, there's lots of people who have never seen DSC or are still learning PowerShell for the first time and things like that. So some videos that range from the most beginner to looking at what it looks like to run Test Kitchen and do some complex validation scenarios and things like that. So I think some assets that like video type content would help a lot. I thought about working on some content that would basically follow the thinking of how do I get out of an outage without randomizing my servers. But the more I thought about that, it's just treating IaaS like PaaS. So maybe that warrants new content, or maybe it's just in addition to like just keep following through with showing examples and things like that. So not sure what the next major thing would be.
So how should people get in touch with you if they want to give you some feedback?
Twitter's easiest.
Yep.
I'm at Stephen Murawski on Twitter.
And I am at Greene, Migreene.
I'm HowR9000. Not sure if you were asking me, but
So
Sure.
people can send their release pipeline feedback to you, Hal?
sure. I'll just filter it on to Steve. Michael.
I would be really interested as you're picking who else you're going to have on the show. Dave Wyatt's in the chat room. I think it's been a while, hasn't it, since he's been on the show?
Yeah, it's probably
A lot
been a
of these
couple
topics,
years.
yeah,
It's been a while.
touched on some stuff where I'd like to hear his input for testing and validation, and he's in the chat room, so.
Yeah, we'll have to do that for sure. So, Jonathan?
So we'll start with you, Michael. Our question for you this time around is, what was your first computer?
We had an i386. So I grew up on a farm, and our first computers were mostly for bookkeeping.
Okay.
So I forget which version of DOS that would have been. And then we got a 486. And so a couple of things happened then. One was I think we had something for Windows 3.1 where we could create maps. It was really just like a basic CAD application, but my dad figured out that I could draw maps of his fields for the farm and that he could use those in his bookkeeping. And then I figured out at one point that I could link those two machines over serial and share files and things like that, and that kind of got the fire burning. Like both the holy cow, these things can talk to each other, and then like there's an interest that I could create stuff here and people would incorporate that into their business, and that's interesting. And then, that's how you end up being 17 at 3 o'clock in the morning on a dial-up to a BBS, and your mom picks up the phone. What are you still doing?
No!
Come on, no, you were
My download was at 98%.
Yeah, you were downloading dirty pictures.
One line at a time. No.
What baud rate?
Yeah.
How far back do you go?
I don't remember if it was 1200. It seems like that was fast, though. I remember that we were stuck, like newer speeds were coming out all the time, and we were stuck on something that felt just horribly slow.
Yes.
I don't think I ever had to deal with 300 baud. I don't remember having to go that slow.
I remember 300 baud, not for very long, but I think I went from 3, skipped 12, and I went to 2400.
Yep, that's same.
So, Stephen, our question for you is, where do you like to go on vacation?
Oh, so I actually, I really don't. Yeah, I'm actually just finishing up my vacation. But I really don't like to go anywhere. But my wife likes to travel, and so she likes the beaches in Michigan, along Lake Michigan, and so we went there for a week, and so that was a lot of fun.
So what is a Great Lake beach like as compared to, you know, the Atlantic or Pacific or Gulf?
So let's see, that would be the east side of Lake Michigan. They're actually pretty nice beaches, real fine sand, and there's a couple of communities that really take care of and have very nice beaches with a lot of great facilities. And on my side of Lake Michigan, it kind of sucks. And we just dump. Well, the city of Milwaukee just dumps a bunch of sewage anytime it rains. They built processing that doesn't really handle rain because 2 municipalities have combined sewers, and so anyway, we dump a lot of poop in the lake, and so it's not worth going to the beaches in the Milwaukee area. And but they're super nice, clean, with real nice facilities and a lot of like play stuff for the kids, and so it was really nice. So we were in the St. Joseph community. There's a Silver Beach there, and that was just a lot of fun. So, and it's a very cheap vacation. It's a short drive. Yeah, short drive, and a very inexpensive area to vacation.
Short drive with children is good.
Yep.
All right. Thank you very much, guys, for coming on and being a little patient with the start of the stream there.
Oh, no problem.
Yeah, I'm going to go find a place to curl up in the corner and cry before I rebuild this thing before we have Jeffrey Snover on in 2 weeks.
That'll be good.
Maybe we should just, end up going this route and, not rebuild the whole monstrosity.
There are problems with this route. It's going to depend on what the audio sounds like and how difficult it is for me to deal with the audio that we get.
Yep. Yeah. We'll see. We'll see here very shortly, Jonathan. All right. I'm going to go ahead and cut the recording, and thank you very much. Thanks for the chat room. And thanks, Michael, and thank you, Stephen. And
sure.
Yeah,
you get Dave on again. And I'm glad that we actually got to record this time. It's been too long, Jonathan.
Yes, way too long. I clearly have forgotten what in the hell I'm doing.
I'm interested in hearing about some of the stuff that you've been working on, Jonathan.
Yes, I'm looking forward to talking to you about that.
But I think that would be a cool podcast sometime, too.
Don't know if I can podcast about that.
Okay.
I would need to get permission.
Shut down.
But honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if they would let me talk about it.
Gotcha.
Home Depot's actually pretty cool about that.
Nice.
Neat. So, Jonathan, I've got my my Dropbox client, and
okay.
I'm looking at recently changed files, and I have like an MP3 with everybody's name on it. So I will sample these and send you over a lot of them.
Okay, perfect.
Cool.
Yeah,
and
neat service.
Yeah, if you guys want to talk about Habitat sometime, I'm more than happy to dig into that. So we might want to wait a little while till it becomes a little more concrete because it's still very early stages. But Habitat itself is released, but not for Windows because I'm starting on that when I get back from vacation.
Gotcha. All right. So. Good night, everybody. Thanks again.
Thanks, guys.